Hello and welcome to Kushti TV, always the straight talking YouTube channel where my specialist subjects are boxing, golf and of course I interview people of all other interests. Please remember to click unsubscribe. I need you guys to come on board. I'll keep delivering, you keep subscribing. Now today's topic is boxing. Yes. Boxing, I'm going to bring to light today six, wait for this, six, not three, six British Gypsy World Champions. You might be thinking, oh, you're aware of three, but I'm going to bring into light all six, and I'm also furthermore going to bring in my small connection with these champions, some a bit more than others. Anyway, please allow me to bring into focus the six British Gypsy Champions of the world. I'm going to start with Andy Lee. Andy is technically a Cockney. He was born in Bow, under the sound of the Bow Bells in East London. He has Irish nationality now. He spent most of his life living in Limerick. But Andy, the very, very hard-punching Andy Lee, had put the handbrake on the highly rated Matt V. Korobov to lift the WBO Championship of the world. Well, I have never met Andy. He's meant to be a nice bloke, comes across well on TV, but my small connection with Andy is I have some cousins, Lees, that are relatives of him distantly down the line. Andy held his title until he met Billy Joe Saunders, our next person in their brilliant fight. Of course, Billy Joe Saunders had defeated Lee to win away his WBO middleweight title. Now, Saunders, the brilliant loose hand southpaw that can switch both ways, become a two-weight world champion. You know, full up with skill, class. It took 7 years he reigned as a two-weight world champion. It took none other than the very king of today, pound for pound king, Canelo Alvarez, to stop him and take his titles in a fight which I thought Saunders looked comfortable enough. Of course I wasn't in there, that's the way he made it look. I thought he was looking comfortable enough, and I had him one rounder ahead until he sustained a dreadful eye injury. So that is our second world champion. Billy Joe Saunders and myself do have something in common. Our great-grands are first cousins, and if I've got my recollection right, that makes our great-great-grandfather from the eastward side the same great-great-grandfather. So we've got the same great-great-grandfather from the eastward side of our family, and his dad Tom. We share first cousins respectively. So that's what I have in common with Billy Joe, our second champion of the world. Our third champion of the world, of course, I'm bringing in to light, is the current world champion. Of course, he is the Gypsy King, Tyson Fury. You know, in 2015, he dethroned the absolute brilliant, great Vladimir Klitschko in Germany to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. A fantastic display, as we know. Still today, other than his knockouts, personally, I still think it's his best display. I thought he was up against a slightly harder, younger Klitschko than when Joshua boxed him. Albeit only a year or two, but that sort of time, a few years makes a big difference when you're on the tail end of your career. But anyway, the third Gypsy champion of the world, Tyson Fury, the part Irish traveller, part Romany Gypsy. I've never met, but we have a little in common. Through his Price family, again, I have some cousins that are relation to Tyson, I believe, through the Price family. Furthermore, he had an uncle, a great uncle called Ticker Gorman. Ticker Gorman was very good friends with my grandfather. They were fellow heavyweight boxers. My grandfather renamed Jack Daly was a good friend when he come from the north of England to London. My grandfather, you know, looked after him, not that he needed looking after, but he made him welcome as a family and as a friend, and they become good mates. So we have that much in connection, and Ticker Gorman was the uncle of the world famous Bartley Gorman. So that's my connection with the Gypsy King. One day I might meet him, you never know. So that's our first 3 British Gypsy world champions into focus. But our next 3 British world champions couldn't live and enjoy the fruits of hard labour and success that Lee, Fury and Saunders have enjoyed. Yes, they could enjoy their success, they could enjoy the money, they could enjoy the fame, but they couldn't freely expose themselves as gypsies, as of course Saunders, Lee and Fury does. Now, one might ask, why not? Well, let me tell you something. Pre-war, things were much different. We do enjoy the freedoms. Here I am, I'm openly saying I'm a English Romany gypsy, very, very proud of it. Yeah, but I don't seem to hold me back too much these days. But please allow me to paint a picture and the reason why these guys would have wanted to stay under the radar, because it would have massively impeded their opportunity of climbing the ladder. Whilst you might think, yeah, well, the fight game is a game where we put all nationalities, all race, there's no barriers there, just chuck them all in and see who the hardest man is. Boxing has always had an element of that, but when you become a famous boxer, it's got other sides to the life, you know. So I'm going to just explain it on a little bit. Here I've got some English law. I've done a bit of research. Yeah, so English law in 1534, it was called an Egyptian Law Act. In 1534 it was passed, and it says anybody being a gypsy in England or an Egyptian respectively had 16 days to leave the country. Failure to do so would result in execution. However, they did change the law some, and it got a bit easier in 1550. So now the law had changed. It said that anybody living as a gypsy would now only have all of their possessions taken from them, and if you gave up your naughty, idle, ungodly way of life, you would be okay, but failure to do so would result in execution. So it got a little bit easier, but not much did it really. You couldn't live your way as a life as a gypsy because you would be executed. Now, we move on to 1939 all the way up, and we had a bloke called Adolf Hitler who had the execution opinion on Romanies. It was reported at least 500,000 Romanies in Europe gypsies were murdered. So he still had quite a dampened opinion. But in 1947 it did get much easier, quite a bit easier, not really easy, but 1947 post-war in Spain, they had a law where if you spoke Romany language, Gypsy Romany language in Spain, the law for that was an execution. They would just cut your tongue out. So get a bit easier, okay? But can you really see where these guys, just give me a minute and I will bring them into focus, these champions, these brilliant world champions, but you can see why they wanted to go under the radar. Now what I don't quite understand is you can use a stereotypical type of gypsy if you like. You can, what they paint as a stereotypical gypsy. He goes around in his truck, he stays on some unwelcomed, unwanted, he's not wanted on some land, stays on there, doesn't pay his tax, goes out, gets some work in his truck, tips some rubbish up. Yeah, okay, you've got the picture. But back in 1530, there were no tax law, there were no motorised vehicles. So I'm wondering, there couldn't have been any tipping on any land, and there couldn't have been any tax evasion. So you see how deep-rooted this hatred is and why they would want to go under. But anyway, all you fellow gypsies, Romanies and gypsies from all backgrounds, got some good news for you. I found out while doing this research, found out where the word pikey come from. Okay, I know some of you are overly offensive about being called pikey, but it's not too bad really. During the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries in England, they had 8,000 toll roads, which were called turnpikes. And because we were always on the road, we were called turnpike pikeys, become shortened pikeys. So it just meant somebody on the road. It's not such a bad abbreviation. It's not such a bad derogatory. So things are loosening, we're learning a bit more. Anyway, sit back and allow me to bring the other three world gypsy champions into focus. Allow me to take you through the more historic world gypsy boxing champions, and our first one was largely unknown even to this very day. The public would not know him as a Romany English gypsy. Born in 1919, Bournemouth, to father James, better known as Jim Mills. Jim Mills was a totter. For those of you who don't know what a totter is, you go out and collect scrap metal. And mother, Hilda, known as Lottie Gray. Hilda Gray, better known as Lottie Gray. The little Mills Jr. would, at his 11th birthday, with a pair of boxing gloves. Of course, this little Mills Jr. was Freddie Mills. He started out as a gardener's assistant, whilst moving on to a milkman's assistant. Percy the milkman had young Freddie Mills as an assistant. Well, Percy the milkman was no ordinary milkman. His brother Gordon was the Welsh flyweight champion. So now we had the young Freddie Mills that had taken some interest with his first pair of boxing gloves at 11. He's a spar with his brother Charlie. Now when he meets Percy the milkman and introduces him to his brother Gordon Cook, the Welsh champion, Welsh professional champion, there seems to be no looking back. He plied his trade on the boxing booths, Mills, before turning professional at the age of 17. He continued progressing nicely, and he joined the Royal Air Force. In 1940 he was dubbed the Bournemouth Bombshell. In 1942 some boxing continued during the war, and he knocked out Len Harvey. And didn't only knock him out, he knocked him out the ring to become the British light heavyweight champion. In 1945 he challenged Gus Lazenvich for the championship of the world. For outside issues of boxing, it was reported Mills just was nowhere near prepared, and he got stopped in 10 rounds for his 15-round fight. But in 1949 his opportunity would come to take on Lazenvich when he was priming right, and priming right he was, in the famous old London stadium, West London Stadium, White City. The great, brilliant Lazenvich just couldn't hold off the Bombshell, also known as Fearless Freddie Mills. He put on a two-handed assault and just relentless, and he had Lazenvich a champion down twice. He won on a 15-round points decision. So champion of the world is Freddie Mills. Went on to be a huge TV and radio star. Of today, he would be, at least, if you can equate to what David Beckham is now and what he was even, say, 10, 15 years ago, extremely famous man. By exposing himself as a Romany gypsy would not have helped any of that huge success he had beyond his boxing career. For Mills, however, he didn't expose himself as a Romany gypsy, but he didn't completely cut ties with the Romany people in their way of life. I have something slightly in common with Mills. My grandfather fought Freddie Mills. My grandfather's ring name is Jack Daly, real name Aaron Smith, but professional ring name Jack Daly. Fought Freddie Mills on the boxing booth over 3 rounds, which was declared a draw. They were 17 and 18 respectively, and they were actually built to fight. actually as professionals, and it didn't take place due to war. But in 1949, whilst camping near Shepperton Studios, my grandfather, in a Gypsy horse-drawn wagon, I just finished a workout on his punch bag. Hung it up by the tree, done some work. Who had driven past in a chauffeur-driven car, heading for the famous studios Shepperton, just outside of London, was the man himself, Freddie Mills. He asked his driver, "Stop the car, please." There's an old friend, so he gets out, approaches my grandfather, they embrace, and Mills gives my Uncle Wally some money, little baby, just gives him a big old fiver, the biggest currency then, I'm told, and you know, spent some time chatting to my grandfather, and before he's heads off for his meeting in the famous film studios, he says to my grandfather, "Would you spar with me for the Ledoux fight? I have a world championship, second attempt at it against Ledoux. Would you spar with me? I'll pay you well." My grandfather agreed. You know, because my grandfather was a leading fighter. He wasn't Freddie Mills, he was a champion of the world, but he was in the top 10, 12 in the country. He fought for titles himself, so it was prime sparring. There was some 300-400 light heavyweights in the UK then, and he was up amongst the top, my grandfather. So that's my connection with Britain's other world champion, Britain's Freddie Mills, the Bournemouth Bombshell. So, not many of you know that, but he was a Romany Gypsy. Sadly, the Bournemouth Bombshell fearless Freddie Mills was found dead with a gunshot wound to his head, aged just 46. And to this very day, he was originally deemed a suicide, but it's since been opened, investigated this murder. To this very day, it's clouded in mystery to what happened to the great Freddie Mills. Allow me to bring in our other historic champion. It's a story I can only find a little sad. Of course, he enjoyed the peaks of life, but this one I do find a little disappointing. Born George Stanley in 1876, he became better known as Digger Stanley. Now, Digger Stanley was born in Kingston, just outside of London, and of course to Gypsy Romany parents. Aged just 12, really hard up for money, they went to a boxing booth, and the boxing booth owner allowed him to have a go, and he done well. And his dad allowed, I find this a bit disappointing, but his dad allowed him to travel with the booth, pretending he was 14 years of age when he was just 12, to get some money. And but that side didn't become too sad, because he didn't get hurt too much. He obviously endured pain, but he found a way. This the little Stanley, the bantamweight, he could tie people's arms up. Where he was such a young age, he learned to tie people up and stop them from working. Apparently become a genius at it. You know, so pretending he's 14, eventually he turns professional, and he just goes through the ranks. And in 1910, he became the world champion. He beat Joe Belcher. He then defended against John Condon, and he then went all the way. Wait for this one. He went listen to this, 6 weeks he travelled. It took him to travel to America to defend against Frankie Burns, and the fight was deemed a draw, so he still would have been world champion, of course. But the New York Sun, he went all the way to New York. The New York Sun said that they thought that Stanley won the fight, no trouble. He had one more fight in Philadelphia, but that wasn't for a title, it was just over a 6-round fight, strangely enough, which also was deemed as a draw. The Americans loved his style, he loved him as a person, but he bought a greengrocer business back in London, and I think it was reported, he said he was homesick, but I don't think he really liked the decisions also. So there was a bit of a mixed opinion on that. Was it his bad decisions in the US, or was he homesick? It was probably both. But we know that it appeared 2 fights, 2 draws and it was reported he won them. He travelled back, of course. He then defended to Ike Young Bradley successfully, and he beat a brilliant French fighter called Charles Ledoux in 1912. He would lose his world title to Charles Ledoux the very next year. He fought a brilliant Welsh fighter called Bill Bayon for the British title. Now, you've got to bear in mind, George Digger Stanley, had twice won the British title, and we know the rules. Most of you boxing fans out there know it. If not, I'll explain it. If you win it for a third time, you get to keep the Lonsdale belt. Now, the Lonsdale belts in those days, they were absolutely brilliant and fine now, but back in the day they were made of gold, I think I've got that right. They were hugely expensive, just a trophy or the belt in itself. And he had battered Bill Bayon in a fight only to lose, and it was reported that it was because of his gypsy roots that he was robbed, and it was also reported that it was because of the wealth. The British, whoever put the Lonsdale belt, they put it up, I think this is pre-British Boxing Board of Control, so the authorities who put it up was giving away a huge prize. So it was either because he was a gypsy, he was extremely badly robbed. I mean, we talk about recent modern robberies, but apparently this one was it was more than a robbery. It was just beyond what could have happened. He way won the fight. But it was so bad, the public outcried, of course, they all paid for the tickets, then there were no TV stuff and pay-per-view, it was all go and watch, and the public outcried, the press jumped on it, and they gave him his opportunity to beat Bayon to win the Lonsdale belt, and which he duly did. So he was an absolute exceptional fighter. He put his age up, and as he went through his career, somebody said to him, you don't get many fights offered to you after the age of 27. So he put his age up to 14 when he was 12, and when he got to 27, 28, 29, 30, etc., apparently he stayed at 27 for about 5 years. So completely illiterate and could not read. All right. There's a story where he buys, with his winnings, a huge gambler as well, apparently, Stanley, with his winnings of a fight, he buys this beautiful fob pocket watch, and he will continuously get it out of his pocket and say to people, here, look at that, and people thought he was being flash, and he used to say, what does it say? And the sad ass reality was he couldn't even tell the time, so he was constantly getting out of his pocket. People thought he was showing it off, and he wasn't. He'd say, what does that say? He wanted to know if it's 12:15, etc., 1:15, whatever the case. A bit disappointing there, but he didn't have much education outside of his boxing, but he was hugely educated in the ring, this little champion. But what I find really sad, he loved his gambling, and it brought his career down. He was travelling away on an horse and a trotting match, as many travellers still do today. He's trotting away racing a fellow traveller, I presume, in a race, and he falls off, hurts his hip, and he doesn't quite have the mobility, and it eventually brings his career to an halt. But he sadly died aged just 43, that's just young. But what I find, this little warrior was fighting for at least 30 years of his 43 years of life. He was a fighter. I find that a little bit disappointing, putting it mildly. I do have a connection with Digger Stanley. I have a couple of connections actually. My daughter-in-law was Stanley. She's half Stanley on my mother's side, and furthermore, my actual family stayed with Digger and his family on Wandsworth Common in London. So that's my connection to this other brilliant little warrior. Hats off to all of them, of course, and you as well, Digger. A little sad to die at that age. And finally, I'm going to bring into focus an historic British world champion. In fact, he became the first champion of the world of any nationality, any background. He travelled to America. Born in Beeston, he became better known as the Swaffham Gypsy. James Mace would be known as Jem Mace, pronunciation difference from Norfolk. The Gypsy as he progressed, he was given the name the Swaffham Gypsy because he was from Swaffham and he was a gypsy, but as his career moved on, he somewhat become famous and he tried to shun it, and we'll talk about a bit more about that. He came to notoriety. He was also a keen fiddle player. Music was a big part of gypsy culture, as it is in every culture, but they would be often seen as singing and playing instruments around their campfires, and one that Jim Mace became very good at was the fiddle. And he was outside a pub, this pub pictured here in Great Yarmouth, and he was minding his own business, playing his beloved fiddle and music, trying to make a few bob. And 3 drunk fishermen come outside the pub and started hailing abuse at Mace, and one of them broke his fiddle. Now, very angered was Mace, but the final chipping point was one of them said, "Your mother is an whore." And then, without any warning, Mace just let loose and obliterated, KO'd the 3 big, young, strong, beard up fishermen. They were laying out like kippers. The fishermen were out like some of the stuff they probably caught early in the day. They were flat out like kippers. And he picks up his broken fiddle, and it was just coincidental that there was a Jewish gentleman overlooking. He'd seen what had happened, and he walked straight to Mace. He said, "Here, I think you better come to London with me. We can make lots of money with your fighting skills." And this is where the Swaffham Gypsy, Jim Mace, he went to London and doing his business. He was the first, apparently he was the very first artistic, technical type of fighter of his time. It was normally just fist wading him without any technique, but he found a way to go in and out. He was a very clever fighter. He was an heavyweight, he fought in the heavyweight division, and he obviously grew and matured, but he was only like of today's money, he was in pounds, he was only 10 and a half, 11 stone, but he developed a bit, and he fought all the heavies. And eventually he got a fight in America, and they deemed it against their American champion. He went over, travelled from Britain, and went over and won the world champion, and he was deemed Britain's first ever, and I don't mean, let's get it right, I don't mean first ever gypsy, I mean first ever champion of the world. Now, fame would come along with this. Some of you might have watched the film The Lawman, the famous lawman White Earp. He was become good friends with him, and it wasn't only Lawman he befriended, it was Ned Kelly, the infamous, because he fought, Ned Kelly's gang was based in Australia. Of course, White Earp was America, but he actually fought, you've got to listen to this, all around the world. He went from America, Australia, New Zealand, and as fame had taken him up, he was in denial of being a gypsy, because it wouldn't have done him any favours. Instead, he said, "Oh, it's my cousin that's a Romany gypsy, Paulie Mace. His mum's a gypsy," but he wouldn't have got the rights. He didn't even declare it in his biography. Now, you got to remember, back in the days before television, a book would have been massive, lots of money for Jim, and so he denied it in his book. But the harsh reality is, one reporter actually said he only got the name Gypsy because he met fierce unwelcoming in America and Australia from Irish people that immigrated. They weren't very welcoming and forthcoming, and I just don't see what difference that would have made by an Englishman from Norfolk pretending he was a gypsy to soften the unwelcome from an Irishman. An Irishman either likes an Englishman or he doesn't, back in those days, is the way it was. So there was a ludicrous story. Yeah, so that wasn't the case. So further to cement, he actually schooled, when I say schooled, he actually was paid as a trainer because he was so technically brilliant even in those days. In fact, he's now been recognised on the Hall of Fame, I think in New Zealand, Australia, possibly America, I'm not sure. I've done some research but I can't remember off the top of my head. But he actually set up boxing schools, and it was reported to the great, brilliant American fighter, Iron Mike Tyson, who would you love to meet in Britain? And he said if I could it would be Jim Mace. So he's done his history, he's in great awe of Jim Mace. Yeah, just to cement the fact that he was a gypsy, he actually died aged 79 in Liverpool, England, still living in a gypsy caravan. But what you might find completely fascinating, wait for this, he had his last fight aged, come on now, wait for this, 78 years of age. He continued. I don't know if that's a sad thing or a great thing, but again I believe just a bit like Stanley before him, and even Mills, I believe, all gamblers, and I think maybe his wealth, even the huge amounts of money they would have got, because I mean huge amounts of money, it's all pro rata, you know, getting 100 quid then would maybe like getting 100,000 now, whatever, but the huge amounts of money he made was gone, and I'd probably find it a bit sad that he was still fighting at the age of 78, 1 year before he died. Okay, there were exhibitions, but people wouldn't watch exhibitions for you to get for punches not to land. They still landed. Age 78, and he died in his gypsy caravan, aged 79. Apparently he did live an hell of a life. It was a bit of a fanfare. So that was our first ever champion, and that brings our 6 world champions. I didn't have anything in common with Jim Mace except the fact that we're both English Romany gypsies, but a little bit I did, and I have I had a property in the town of Great Yarmouth, and I have drunk in the pub where he come to notoriety, where he was playing outside. So that's my small connection. Fellow English Romany, both done a bit of boxing. He was done it a little bit better than me, and of course I've drunk in that pub where he come to notoriety. I hope you've enjoyed the stories of these 3 other world champions being brought to light, and my connections, slight connections to the modern ones. Remember, click and subscribe. Tune in for next time. We've got more to come. Bye for now. Box Clever.